Hi guys. So this is going to be a multi-part tutorial to show you how you can use test-driven development practices in Drupal 8. I will focus on writing a form. This form will have a few particular aspects, like a file upload with a custom file validator. The form will be different based on user permissions, and then there will be some basic validation as you would expect to see in any form. And then upon submission, the form will create some entities. So the goal is really to use TDD. So I'm going to stick exclusively to unit tests wherever possible. But obviously for the entity writing upon submission, we will need a kernel test. But the goal is really to show you that you can test Drupal forms without ever relying on a functional test. So with all this, let's begin. The first thing we're going to do is set up our testing environment. And I'm going to use the Drupal Composer project for Drupal, which is Ajax dev, and it's going to be let's call it D8 TDD. So if you've never used the Drupal Composer project, I really recommend you look into it. It's really, really good. So this is going to take a minute. Of course. So now that this is set up, so basically, if you don't know it, it puts the vendor and some helper scripts outside the web root, and Drupal itself is inside the web. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to prepare a custom module, which I'm going to call form validation. Here we go. And I'm going to open it in my IDE. So here we are. So the first thing we want to do is, of course, flesh out our modules. So the first thing is to create our info YAML file. We're going to call it form validation example. I'm a terrible typer. Obviously, the type is a module. So, before I begin, I want to show you what I have in mind for this form. So in typical TDD, you would first start writing your tests, but I find it easier sometimes to at least get the basic structure fleshed out. It helps me to focus then on actually writing the logic. So this is going to be our form. Our namespace nation form. We're going to use, well, we first get book import form extends form base. So first thing we want is we need the get form ID function, which will be form validation book import. We can just inherit the documentation. And the other thing we need is build form. And then in later videos, I will show, I'm going to put it here already, inherit doc. The validation callback. And obviously, the submission, well, callback method. So in our form, we will have a file upload, which will be a CSV file upload. The type is going to be managed file for reasons that will become apparent later. And the idea is that the structure is as follows. The first column contains the book title, and all the other columns contain the authors. So you need a minimum of 2 columns, but you can have as many as you want. And what we want to do is that we want to validators. Here we go. We want to call different validation callbacks to validate the upload. So the first one we want to call is the Drupal core validate extensions, the file validate extensions callback, and we want to see that the extension is CSV. And then we want to call our own callback, which I'm going to call form validation validate CSV. Keep it nice and simple, and we don't need any other parameters except, of course, the file gets passed anyway. Next, while I'm at it, I'm gonna finish building my form. So I'm gonna put a submit button. Not that I actually am going to test this, but that way it's already done. So this will be a submit button. The value, of course, localized submit, and the button type, of course, be the primary button, and we return. Okay, so as you see, now we have our very simple form, and the first thing we want to do is we want to write logic for the file validation. So the way this works, we need to define this as a function. And the location where you define this is in the modules.module file. Validation module. So file validation callback. And here we are going to use a file interface. And a file validation callback should return an array of errors. So if the list is empty, then it means that there are no errors. List of validation issues, if any. Here we go. So here is where we're actually going to start our TDD. So we want to test this function, pass it several different files, and make sure that our logic works. The way we want to do this, of course, is by creating source unit, some unit tests. I'm going to create a new PHP class, which I'm going to call ESV validation test. I'm going to put the namespace afterwards because PHP Storm tends to get confused. Extends the unit test case. We find in Drupal unit test and that's better. Let's put it in the correct namespace, which will be Drupal form validation tests unit. Here we go. So here we have our test case, and let's test validation. So basically we want to have some test file, a test CSV file that we will pass to our function, and we want to check that we get the correct error. So let me create a fixture. Fixtures. Let me start by creating a file with, let's say, an incorrect format. So I'm going to call it books incorrect format CSV. So title, author. So we will only accept a CSV that actually formatted with a comma. So here I'm going to use a semicolon. So this should not work. To kill a mockingbird by Harper Lee. And let's put another one. The pragmatic programmer by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas. There we go. So, so this is, in a certain sense, a valid CSV, but we will not accept it. And let's check our errors. So we want to this assert equals. We expect an error message. How shall we write this? Let's say the CSV format is incorrect. Use commas. Let me put this on a new line to make it a bit more readable. And here we want to core function. And here we go. Now, this obviously is not going to work because we know we need to pass a file here, but in typical trust-driven development, let's actually use it. So we're going to use PHP unit. The PHP unit file is in web core, and this is a little trick you can use, is you pass the path to where the tests are located. This is a bit faster, so you could use like filter or group, but if you use filter and group, PHP unit will still have to parse all existing unit tests. If you do it like this, the execution will be much faster. So if we run this, we'll fail. Boom. Call to undefined function form validation test unit form validation CSV. So what's the problem here? Of course, we have not loaded our form validation module file. So how can we get around it? Well, simple enough. Function setup. Of course, we need to keep the parent setup. A unit test, you always want the parent setup at the top, so before you start doing stuff. Let's require once. So this is not the cleanest way, but bear with me. So we are in unit, or in source and tests. PHP unit is very helpful. PHP Storm is very helpful, so we know that this is correct. So now we require, boom. Okay, so it complains we're not passing enough arguments to our form validate CSV, which is indeed correct. This is obviously wrong. So how can we pass this? So the easiest way, I guess, we could tackle this is to actually use a test double instead of creating an actual file. Because if you want to use an actual file, we're going to need to have a kernel test, and that's not what we want. We want to use a unit test. So let's create a file. This get mark, and we use a file interface. And expects this any method. So what we will do is that we will use the getFile URI method to actually load the file. So will this return value. Will return value. So let's move up to go to fixtures, and then we use books incorrect format. Incorrect form. Oh, I made a typo. Incorrect form. It should be format. I see PHP Storm helpfully changed it there as well. So let's pass this file now to our validation. You see that now PHP Storm is not complaining anymore, so this should at least not give us an error. Boom, it's working. So let's give this a new error. And let's put this. Now, you might notice what I did here. I'm using T because this function is supposed to return a localized version of the error message. And now you will see that we're gonna run into an issue. So if I run this, call to undefined function T. Now why is it saying this? It's saying this because in a unit test, you do not have access to any of the Drupal APIs. True, you can load all the classes and everything, but the only reason you can do that is because you are using the composer autoload dump. But in fact, there's nothing of Drupal there, which is why you cannot use function T. Now, how do we get around this? If you want a quick and dirty version, you use a kernel test, or, God forbid, a functional test. But we want to use unit tests, so how can we get around this limitation? We could try and make a test double for T, but it's really fragile and it's best to avoid it. So one thing we can do is that we can actually use a class. If we use a class, the class can can use the string translation trait, as it should. And if we use the string translation trait, we can use test doubles for the translation part. And then we simply proxy the calls to this function from our form to our custom class. So let's do that. I'm going to create a new, it's just a new PHP file. I'm going to call it CSV validator. For validation, CSV validator it's not going to use anything. It's not going to extend anything. We will just have a public static function validate, and here we will use the file interface again. And we can simply copy this here and use a string translation trait. Oops. And I'm going to use self t. The idea would be that here we should return the CSV validator validate file. Now, if you know the Drupal API, you will know that this cannot work. The reason is this: you see, PHP Storm is highlighting it. Non-static method t should not be called statically. Oops. Indeed, the string translation trait gives us access to the t method, but it's not static. We should call it like this. But if we want to call it like this, we cannot have a static method called validate. See, here it works. So here, we should actually instantiate an instance of our class before we call validate. So either we can call like validator equals new CSV validator, but a method I prefer in this particular case is to define a service. So if we go here, we can actually create a services file, validation service. Is it service or services? I always forget. Let me quickly check. It is services, indeed. It makes sense actually when you think of it. So services form validation, which is the name of a module. I'm going to call it CSV validator, and the class will be our new class. And then the way we call this is that we return Drupal service. I'm going to reuse this CSV validator. So now this could work, but again, it's not going to work for a very simple reason. Drupal core container is not initialized yet. So we're still running into another issue. Obviously, I'm going through all this to show you what it takes to set up a unit test. But once you know all this, it's actually much easier. And a container builder. So what we need to do is in our setup method, before we run our test, we need to create a new container. So in our container, we're going to create, register. Let me create a validator, new CSV validator. And I want to register my service. And in Drupal set container, I'm going to call container. Now we run into another issue, which is we don't have the string translation service. Now this, luckily for us, the string translation service is actually really simple. We don't really need it in our particular case. We just can use a dummy empty, an empty testable. So let me just quickly check which, it's the translation interface. Yeah, that's the one. So we are going to use a mock. This mock, which is a translation interface class, and then container actually I can use set string translations. And here we have an issue again. So don't be discouraged. I'm actually showing you all this for a good reason. It takes a little bit of practice to use unit tests in Drupal. It takes a lot more mocking, a lot more to set up, but it's really, really worth it because unit tests are much, much faster than kernel tests. And for something like this, or like a form where you don't actually need to write any data, like entities, using unit tests makes a lot of sense. Of course, it's a bit more complex than using kernel tests because Drupal is complex. But trust me, it's really worth it. So the error we get, I don't know if you noticed, we expect a string. Well, what do we get? We get a translatable markup object. What does that mean? Well, here we're actually using this t. This t doesn't return a string like it did in Drupal 7. It returns a class. So this assertion is not going to work. So there are two ways we can go about this. We can either make sure that this renders as a string, but this will mean we need to mock a lot of other stuff in Drupal, so it's going to be complicated. Or we go the quick and dirty way. We actually use t around this guy, which is what I prefer. So it's not the best way to do this in a unit test, but in our case it will suffice. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to actually make my unit test translation aware. Now that I'm using this trait, I can actually do this. And finally we're green. So now we can actually start writing our logic. So if I remove this, now our test should be red, exactly. The way we want to do this, we're gonna open the file, get a file URI, we're gonna open it in read mode. And the first test is about the format. So analyze the file format. We should get 2 columns. I'm going to use the fgetCSV function. fgetCSV. Pass it a file handler. And if empty, the row or the count is smaller than 2, this is a reasonable expectation. Say, okay, if the row is empty or if it's not an array, it's less than 2, then we have an error. We'll actually not go any further than this, so we can actually return an array directly. We will need this one later though, so we can put it there. So here I'm going to return, I should have kept that, let me copy it like this. So we return our error, and here, boom, we're green again. Great. So the next thing we want to check is we want to validate that the CSV actually contains 2 columns for each row. And we want to give an error message for every row that has an issue. So if the first row has an issue and the third row has an issue, we don't want to return an error message just for the first row. We want to go all the way through. So let's create a new file, which is incorrect data CSV. So I'm just going to copy paste. So this time we're going to use commas, as you would expect. But I want to do 2 things. So in the first row, there is no author, so this is incorrect. Let me even remove it like this. So there is no second column at all. And in this case, we have the first column which exists but is empty. So this should give us 2 errors. So what we do is that we can copy all this. This time we're going for the incorrect data CSV. And we want to get 2 error messages. So how should we do it? So the author online 1 is empty. You must provide at least 1 author. Let's put it like this. And then we want the second error. So in our file, the second one, oops, it's not this guy, it's this one. The second one, we don't have a title. So the book title on line 2 is empty. You must provide a title for each book. So if we try this again, okay, so our expectation is incorrect, as we would expect. Let's write our logic. So here we can actually go into the errors part. So while, let's go through each row, row equals get CSV. Let's use a quick and dirty trick here. Row. So this might give us an error, for example, if if the row is completely empty. So I can suppress that. This is really not something you should do. As they say, you must know the rules before you can break them. So I know the rules, that's why I say, okay, I'm going to break this one. I'm going to suppress the error if this is not an array, or if this is an array with only 1 item in it. But again, be very, very careful when you suppress warnings like this. So if empty title, we want the error to contain. So actually, let me call it like this. So the title is empty. We want to use this error message, and you will notice if you're being careful that we're going to run into an issue, which is what I expect. Author, let's get the other message. The author online 1 is empty. But of course, we're not going to hard code this. That doesn't make sense. So let's quickly get this. We should at least, okay, this is correct again. But obviously we don't want to hard code this value. We want to use placeholders. And when we use a placeholder, we need something to compute this line. So the line is what? What value? Well, let's just get an iterator, which will be I, and we'll initiate it here. I equals 0, and every time we increment. I can start with 0 because the first row is the headers. Actually, that's wrong. I cannot start with 0. Yes, I can start with 0, sorry. I can start with 0 if I increment first. That's where I was going, because we already have the headers. So the first row is already being computed here. So I already fetched it. So as long as I increment before, I can start with 0. But now, this doesn't work anymore. The reason is that we are now comparing objects, and of course our object now is no longer the same. So what we can do, again, quick and dirty, is that the first message is the title. So I can replace this with this version, and I know that the line is 1. And in this case, the author, I know the line, the title, the line is 2, and the author, the line is 1. So like this. And now, it works. Great. So as you see, we're writing tests, then we're writing logic, writing tests, then we're writing logic. So we're using true TDD practices now. The final thing we want to check is, well, if the file is indeed correct, we should not get any errors at all. So this is our final check. And here we're going to use correct. I'm going to create a new fixture. Let me copy this one. And this time it's going to be books, correct, CSV. So we want to use exactly as we did before, but this time we want to use actual commas. So here, we should not get any errors at all. And indeed, it is correct. So if we pass a correct CSV file, we're not getting any issues. So now, what do you think of this? We actually wrote a test, a unit test, that is checking the validation for this field. Now, as you notice, we're not testing via the interface. We're not using a functional test. We're not using a VAD test for that matter. We're actually only using a unit test, but we know that as long as this one, as this test passes, the validation for the file upload will pass as well. So do we want to have a test that checks if our form is working correctly? Well, it's a nice to have, but I would argue that no, you do not. The reason you do not is that the build form method, what do you do? What are you doing? There's no true logic in here. It's actually configuration because we're using the Drupal API. So there's not really any added value to check that the form is actually being rendered correctly, that the fields are there, that you can use the fields, and that you can click on the submit button. There's no added value to testing that because that's the Drupal API. You don't want to test the Drupal API, you want to test your own module's logic. So that's why I say, when you build a form, don't bother writing a functional test. Go for the unit test. Go for the quickest and easiest way to write a test. Because the faster your test will be to run, the more time you will have to write more tests, to add more test coverage, and to use test-driven development practices. So just maybe let's compute some test coverage. Let's put it in the result. So this is going to take a little bit more time. I just want to, while this is computing, just check this. I mean, 400 milliseconds and 8 megabyte of memory. That's nothing. I mean, if we had done the same thing we did just now with a functional test, it would have taken, I guess, at the very least 30 seconds, maybe even more, and probably a lot more memory. Well, memory maybe you're not really concerned about, but the time you are. When you want to use TDD, it has to be super, super fast, and unit tests provide you with that speed. So, oh, I know, I forgot something. So this is a small trick that I use. Before I run the tests, I actually changed the PHP unit XML file. So let me create a copy. PHP unit XML. And we want to change this. That's why it's taking so long. The test coverage, if it needs to compute it for the whole Drupal core, it's going to take a lot of time. But we're not interested in that. We only want to know what's in our own modules. So usually, for most projects, you would put your own modules in custom and contrib in contrib. So I then even go as far as only compute for our custom modules. In this case, it's at the root of the modules folder. So I'll just keep it like this. Let's run this again. You'll see that this time it will be much faster. Boom. Okay, there we are. I always forget where it puts it. I think it's in core. No. No. Oh, it's here. Oh, it's at the root. Let me open this. So, well, it computed for tests. Obviously, we don't care about that. But let's go to source. We see that our CSV validator class has a 100% test coverage. That's not bad. The form is at 0 right now, but we'll get back to that later. And it's only computing classes, but as you noticed, we're not actually calling the class itself. We're calling this function. So if it computed for this file as well, we'd actually get 100% for this file as well, which is really nice. So still, in total, we're almost at 70% test coverage. And I will show you later that, oh, sorry, we're at 40%, my bad, 40%. But in the later tutorials, you will see that we'll get much, much higher than that because we're also going to test this guy. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It's a bit long. The next parts will be probably much faster because we won't need all the setup time and a lot of stuff is already taken care of. But yeah, I really hope this will help you to write more unit tests and also that it shows you that TDD with Drupal 8 is possible. It is possible without using functional tests, but using unit tests. Cheers!